Treatment in Japanese prisoner of war camps. A look into the lives of prisoners of the Japanese in the Second World War. The question we will be exploring in this presentation asks, which group was treated better in Japanese prisoner of war camps, the native Asians or the foreign British? Background events, culture, and relationships.
The culture of surrender in Japan was unorthodox. Surrender was seen as pathetic and dishonorable. Ritualistic suicide, or harakiri, was performed when a swordsman had been defeated in battle. A source says that, rather than be captured, a defeated swordsman would stab himself in the left belly, draw the blade to the right, then pull upwards. The Japanese saw those who had surrendered to them as pathetic and dishonorable, and treated the prisoners as so.
Japan had started industrializing since the late 19th century. They had also begun imperializing, defeating Russia and also a non-militarized China. As a result, there was retaliation in China. Japan responded through horrendous acts. Civilians were murdered as bayonet practice, raped, and extensively experimented upon. Experiments included injection of diseases, exposure to extreme starvation and cold, and surgeries without anesthesia. The Japanese also air-bombed cities with fleas carrying the bubonic plague. During the scorched earth policy, vast swaths of China were decimated, epitomized by the slogan, "Kill all, loot all, destroy all." After Japan's invasion of China to take over their imports, Japan declared war on China in 1937.
The English and Japanese were allied from 1902 to 1923. Both countries feared Russia and the U.S. during the Russo-Japanese War of 1905. So the agreement between England and Japan was this. Britain would either remain neutral or side with Japan, never joining sides with Russia. Britain's neutrality would be in effect if Russia was Japan's only enemy. However, if Russia allied with another country against Japan, Britain would come to Japan's aid. Ironically enough, no one in England knew Japanese, so when World War II came, high school boys were given scholarships to learn Japanese. These boys coined the name Dulwich Boys because of the college they studied at.
The surrender of the British military base in Singapore, built only in 1938, shocked, devastated, and humiliated Great Britain. Britain did not expect Japan to invade because they assumed the Japanese military was as inexperienced and ineffective as that of China, Japan's enemy at the time. Japan unexpectedly attacked from the swamps rather than the sea. They fought with tactics based on brutality and elements of surprise. Japan's speed and skill can be attributed both to their successful outflanking of the British, as well as their use of bicycles for quick transportation. Allied troops were burned to death by the Japanese. Locals were tortured and killed for assisting the men, and prisoners were forced to build the Burma-Thailand Railway. Singapore was officially surrendered on February 15, 1942, 2 months after Pearl Harbor.
Daily life in a Japanese prisoner of war camp.
Both Europeans and Asians were taken to Chinese internment camps. The Europeans were taken through the fall of Singapore, and the Asians were taken through the invasion of China and the fall of Singapore. Prisoner of war camps in Japan were in a warehouse or a school building and was surrounded with barbed wire fences and wooden walls. The prisoners slept in rooms with rows of bunk beds with thin mattresses and possibly a blanket. They were dressed in rags and were only allowed to shower once a week. The guards supplied ingredients, but the prisoners of war had to prepare their own food. Their rations included a bowl of rice, cup of soup, pickles, and bread once a day. Occasionally they would get meat or fish. The prisoners in the camps took care of each other and divided their workload and shared food. In one of the sources we read, it said that close friendships were a lifeline in Japanese captivity. Later on in the war, the camps were moved to the Sea of Japan because they feared invasion from the U.S. Air Force. In some camps, the prisoners were paid for their work in accordance to the Japanese Army regulations. They were able to spend the money on camp or in neighboring shops. At the beginning of their time spent in the camps, the prisoners could communicate with their families by sending short letters to the Red Cross, but towards the end it was no longer allowed. While the prisoners were in the camps, there was multiple death marches. One in March 1941, where the prisoners were forced to march through the jungles of Borneo, only to be shot when they reached their destination. And later, in 1942, the prisoners were taken to Sandakan to rebuild an airstrip. While they were there, the prisoners were relocated to another island because they thought they were going to be invaded. The supplies and rations of rice got very low, and some were killed because there was not enough food. A Japanese sergeant told prisoners, "There is no rice, so I'm killing a lot of you today." East Indies, there was a prisoner of war camp that held both Europeans and Asians located in Java. Some tried to escape but were caught and executed while other prisoners watched. After witnessing that, barely any prisoners tried to escape. Labor included cleaning, repairing, construction work, and mining. In the beginning of their time in the camp, the women could leave during the day and come back at night. The days spent at camp were very boring and many kept a diary, even though it was forbidden. Food rations started to decrease in 1942, and they began to suffer physical issues because of the lack of food. Disease was extremely common in camps such as dysentery, malaria, typhoid fever, and pneumonia in the camps. Men and women were in separate camps and could not communicate. Men worked on railroads and 1 in 3 died. Women worked in vegetable gardens and sewed clothes for the Japanese army. Multiple times a day they would call roll call, known as tenako. The guards would call out their names in Japanese and they had to bow. The guards would get very confused because they had to count thousands of prisoners. Punishments in the camp would include standing for hours and losing their rations. Some guards would punish the prisoners without knowing the crime they committed. In the beginning, the Red Cross worked with the Geneva Convention to provide aid and food to the prisoners of war held by the Japanese. The Geneva Convention allowed the Red Cross to pass letters from prisoners to their family, although the letters could only be 25 words long and only include family news, nothing else. The Red Cross passed 24 million letters. Later on, the Red Cross had trouble finding the Japanese camps because of the frequent relocations to keep the U.S. Air Force from intervening.
The Burma-Thailand Railway was the largest project completed by Japanese prisoners of war, stretching from Bangkok, Thailand to the neighboring country of Burma. This railway was designed to transport Japanese troops and supplies, and was nicknamed the Death Railway. The men worked 10 days on with 1 day off to rest, slaving away from dawn to dusk. They used rudimentary hand tools, carved through 260 miles of jungle and rock, and completed the railway in less than a year. 13,000 Allied POWs, as well as 100,000 natives, died in the process, and over 100 of the Japanese leaders were later charged with war crimes. The 18th Infantry Division was on their way to desert warfare training in Iran when they were suddenly needed to stay back to defend Singapore from Japanese invasion in late 1942. Unfortunately, out of all the troops, only 800 men were trained in jungle warfare. In March of 1943, Harold Atcherley and his fellow prisoners were moved to Thailand to supposedly stop at a rest camp. However, Sir Atcherley soon found out the truth. They had been taken to Thailand to begin work on the Burma-Thailand Railway, an 8-month-long project that killed 1 man for every wooden Thai laid. As Sir Harold wrote in his diary, "That was the last time we ever believed anything they said to us." A few weeks after the second atomic bomb dropping, his camp was released and made their way back to Britain. Sir Harold described the death and misery of daily life in his diary, which he published late in life. He was knighted in 1977 and died in 2017.
Post-war events and relationships.
In 1945, the Japanese government gave up a list of 73 POW camp locations. However, the Allies discovered a total of 158 camps only on mainland Japan. It took over a month for the many thousands of prisoners to be located. Within 5 months after VE Day, about 32,000 Allied ex-prisoners returned home. Restarting life after the horrors of the internment camps led many former prisoners to join and start POW clubs. These clubs provided support, comfort, and a positive reuniting. The included image shows English Lieutenant Paul Burrow of the Royal Signal Corps. He owned the only radio in a camp in Yokohama, Japan. The Geneva Convention are rules set to protect the injured and helpless in war, unenforced by Japan. After civilian slaughtering in both the Pacific Theater and European Theater, a new Geneva Convention was signed in 1949. In 1950, the POW clubs mentioned earlier demanded a peace treaty with Japan to prevent camps like these from recurring. These men received about 70 pounds during the 1950s, but by year 2000, the ex-prisoners were paid a final amount of 10,000 pounds each. The Dulwich Boys, the young men who learned Japanese after the invasion of Singapore, became ambassadors and Japanese experts, so the British understanding of and relationship to Japan began to grow. The included picture shows a group of former prisoners of war taken in 2014.
To conclude and to answer our original question, the Japanese treated the Asians and the Europeans equally as poorly, especially because most camps included both natives and as well as foreigners. Still, although the Japanese treatment of prisoners was cruel, violent, and sadistic, the Western and the Japanese mentality of war differed greatly. For example, in the Western tradition, soldiers accepted surrender as a last resort, although shame underlied it. In the Japanese tradition, however, surrender was a more dishonorable crime than suicide, so this might better describe the violent and harsh mindset of Japanese soldiers. Still, the thousands who died at the hands of the Japanese suffered unspeakably terrible conditions, whether or not they were native or foreign.